tonight we continue our journey through the Book of Esther, and tonight we're going to wrap up chapter 1. The Book of Esther is an incredible story. It's about a Jewish woman who's living in the capital city, one of the capital cities of the Persian Empire, who eventually in chapter 2 becomes the queen, and her ability to deliver her people and the courage that she showed in being able to do that. And what an incredible story. It's a story of irony. There's humor in this story. There's courage. There's faithfulness. But the most unusual thing about the Book of Esther is that God is never mentioned by name. Yet, as we go through this story, by the time we get to the end, we recognize that the unmentioned God is behind everything that happens in this book. That God had a plan and a purpose, and He was working behind the scenes to make sure that that plan and purpose all fell into place. And that gives us great encouragement today. Often God doesn't do miracles, right and left, but God works through people and circumstances to accomplish His will. And we see that in our own lives every single day. Well, the story begins with a great banquet. Xerxes is the king, and Xerxes has a mission. Xerxes' father, Darius the Great, was a great king, but he lost a war against the Greeks. And Xerxes wants nothing more than to have an opportunity to attack the Greeks and regain some territory and enlarge the Persian Empire. So Xerxes spends 4 years gaining support for this battle against the Greeks, and this great banquet that's talked about in Esther chapter 1 is one of those times when he gathers people together to gain support for his military campaign. So one of the things that he wants people to do is to trust him, believe in him, and then support his military effort by sending troops who will represent Persia in attacking the Greeks to try to recapture some territory. And things are going really well because he throws this incredible banquet. He invites people from all over the empire to come and see the beauty and the luxury of Persia. And so he wants to impress them so that he can promise them, if you help me in this military campaign, I have riches untold that I can share with you. So he is very pompous. His ego is literally as big as the Persian Empire. And he has all these people there, and he wants to impress them. And then finally, the chapter in the middle, it talks about a 7-day banquet where all the leaders of the citadel of Susa are there. And he's trying to get his closest supporters on board for this military effort. And again, he wants people to trust him, that he can lead people into battle and win the war. And things are going great until we have the first surprise in the Book of Esther, which there are many surprises in the Book of Esther. This is the first one. It's day 7, and King Xerxes has summoned the queen to come into the banquet. And part of that is he wants to show off her beauty. We're really not told exactly what he wanted her to do. She's to come in wearing the royal crown. Maybe it was a show of beauty and luxury. Maybe he was asking her to do something immoral. Maybe he was asking her to do something that would disrespect her. But at the end of the day, she says no to the king. Nobody says no to the king, but the queen did. Surprise, surprise, surprise. And if you can somehow put yourself in the shoes of Xerxes, you're trying to convince all of these people that you're this great man, that you can lead them out in battle and win against the Greeks, and your own wife, the queen, stands you up. And people are probably thinking, how's he going to lead us in war if his own wife won't even do what he says? So the king ends up with a credibility problem. How am I going to lead these people and convince them I'm a great leader if my own wife won't do what I want her to do? So she challenges his authority and she embarrasses him. And that's where we left off last week. Well, today we're going to pick up and talk about the rest of the story. And it begins with the king's council. But before we get into that, let me just read the rest of the story. It's in Esther chapter 1, and it's verses 13 through 22. So Esther chapter 1, beginning with verse 13. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king: Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Maris, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 nobles of Persia and Media, who had special access to the king and who were highest in the kingdom. According to law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? He asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and all the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. And let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice. So the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to every province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household, using his native tongue. What a story! In fact, keep in mind that this story was read at the Feast of Purim. And the audience was responding to this story as it's being read. This is a great opportunity, if you ever wanted to make fun of a Persian emperor. This was a great opportunity to make fun of Xerxes, because what he does in this story is absolutely crazy and ludicrous. But yet, apparently, he did it. And so it begins with the king's council. And the king's council is, what are we going to do with Vashti? I mean, queens are not supposed to say no to the king, but she did. How are we going to solve this problem? Well, it's interesting. We learn something about Xerxes right from the get-go. Apparently, he never really learned how to be a husband. Because you would think, this is an issue between the king and the queen. I mean, the king and the queen ought to be able to resolve their own issues. If the king and the queen are in charge of the entire Persian Empire, certainly they can solve their own problems. Because if they can't solve their own problems, how can they solve the problems of the Persian Empire? Well, interesting story. The king has a problem. It's a credibility problem. His wife has stood him up. She didn't come. She disobeyed. She disrespected him. She embarrassed him. She did not show him honor. And honor is a big deal, which we're going to talk about as we proceed tonight. So, it was customary for the king to have experts that they could consult in matters of law and justice. And this was actually a good thing. It's good to have people that you can talk to and get their advice when you have to make a tough decision. What's so interesting about this decision, however, it involves the king and the queen. You would think that Xerxes would take a more personal approach to solving the problem. You would expect him to say to the nobles, what happened was just a lack of communication. We had a little misunderstanding, and don't worry about it because we're going to resolve it. The queen and I are going to fix this all up, and everything's going to be fine. Nothing to worry about. It's a little unusual for the king to take a personal problem, like the relationship with his own wife, to his advisors. That would be like the President of the United States having a disagreement with his wife and taking it to the Supreme Court. So if you're laughing at that, you're laughing at this story as well, because it's just as ludicrous to do that. What king would do that? Xerxes would do that. But it is a good thing to have advisors. And so one of the takeaways from this lesson is that sometimes we really do have issues where we need help. We need advice. We need somebody to speak the words of wisdom into our life. And it's good to have people that we can go to who can speak those words of wisdom. One person is not as smart as several people. And for the king, he had a group of 7 men that he trusted with these issues. So the king is responsible to make all the decisions, but often he needs advice in making those decisions. So he turns to wise people, people who are intelligent and smart, and who are great at speaking words of wisdom so that he can do the right thing. We also learn something else about the king. Conflict resolution apparently just wasn't something he was ever taught. And for most ancient kings going through, generations of royalty, conflict resolution was probably something they were never taught. They were the king. They could do whatever they wanted to do. So they were really never taught how to resolve a conflict. They were never really taught how to find a solution that's a win-win solution for everybody. So King Xerxes is not able to do that. And so he takes this issue to his 7 advisors who were closest to the king. So these nobles, these advisors were in many ways the king's friends, people that he trusted, and he is going to go to them with this issue, seeking their advice. And Herodotus, who was the Greek historian who wrote about the Persian Empire, reminds us that this is true. The king did have a panel of advisors that he could turn to. So historically, this is true. And we have those 7 names that are listed in verse 14. And this reminds us of the 7 eunuchs who were mentioned back in chapter 1, verse 10. 7 in the ancient world was the number of completion. Some people say it was the number of perfection, but it's really the number of completion. And for the ancients, if you have 7, that's kind of the perfect number to have. And so he's got 7 eunuchs that he trusts. He also has 7 advisors that he trusts. These advisors to the Persian king, that got carried on from king to king. Because when we get to the book of Ezra, this is part of a letter, chapter 7, verse 14, is part of a letter that Artaxerxes sent to Ezra. And he says, "You, Ezra, are sent by the king, Artaxerxes, and his 7 advisors." So the king just didn't make decisions on his own. He had 7 advisors to help him. And so these 7 individuals are highest in the kingdom. These are top cabinet positions. In fact, these were lifetime appointments. So these 7 advisors, you got to do this until you died. Kind of like an appointment to the Supreme Court. And maybe we got that from the Persians, I'm not sure. But these lawmakers or these interpreters of the law were to stay on for a lifetime. Now, the word lifetime could be subjective because you're giving advice to the king. And as long as the king likes your advice, you're good to go. However, if you give advice to the king that he doesn't like, he might kill you. And Darius II decided to kill some of his advisors, and Cambyses, who was also one of the emperors, killed some advisors who criticized him. So if you'll put yourself in the position of the 7, you've got to solve this problem. But you dare not criticize the king. Criticize the king, you lose your life. So you can't say to Artaxerxes, Artaxerxes, what you did to the queen was horrible. Asking her to come into that banquet of all those drunken men, what were you thinking? You know, Xerxes, this is not the queen's fault, it's your fault. Well, that's a good way to lose your life. So that can't be the advice that you give to the king. Well, in verse 15, it's interesting how Xerxes approaches this. According to law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? According to law, you're married to the woman. Where's the emotion? Where's the love? It seems to be absent. I mean, this ought to be a personal thing, not a law thing. But Xerxes turns it into a law thing. And he seems to be very stoic about it. He has no emotions about it. Okay, the queen messed up. What are we going to do with the queen? So he gives the responsibility to the 7 advisors to come up with a solution of what to do with the queen. Now, you would think, even in approaching them, that he would say, okay, I need your advice, but here's what I think. You know, after all, I'm married to her. She's the queen. But he doesn't even do that. And it's unlikely that there's a precedent that they can go to in the law where a queen said no to the king, and this is what happened. Chances are that just didn't get recorded. So, it's going to be up to the 7 advisors to come up with a solution. They're going to have to interpret the law and come up with a proposal that the king will endorse. So that is a difficult thing for these group of 7 to do. So they end up with a rather ironic proposal. Memucan is the spokesman for the 7, and he fabricates a crisis out of nothing. And he comes up with a proposal that's supposed to save the king embarrassment. But at the end of the day, it just further embarrasses the king with what he comes up with. Now, he decides that there needs to be a policy that husbands are to be respected, that husbands are to be honored. And basically he says to the king, you know, king, this isn't just your problem. It's the problem of every married man in the empire. We need to be respected. We're men. We're husbands. Our wives need to respect us. So, king, don't feel bad and don't think you're alone. We're all in this with you. Every man in the empire feels your pain. So, king, you haven't lost credibility. In fact, king, maybe you've even gained some more support, because every man can identify with you, and we need to solve this problem. So us men will always be respected and honored as husbands and leaders. Memucan gives one of the longest speeches in the book, which is really not a long speech. It's chapter 1, verse 16 through verse 20. And as you read his speech, you have to wonder, does Memucan have some personal insecurity? I mean, does the guy have some problems at home? and is he just trying to solve not only the king's problem, but his problem too? Maybe some of that is going on. At the same time, Memucan has to come up with a solution that will save the king's honor. Because if he can't, and if he comes up with a solution that will cause dishonor to the king, he could lose his life. So this solution has to be like walking a tightrope. And in many ways, what he comes up with is an ingenious solution. But there's a lot of holes in it. There's a lot of irony in it. There's a lot of humor in it at the same time. Well, let's look at what he comes up with. And as we look at this, the big issue, the relationship between husbands and wives. There's actually a great lesson for husbands and wives in this story, which is at the same time a great model of the ridiculous. So let's take a look at it. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, meaning his other 6 advisors. His conclusion, Queen Vashti has done wrong. He could have probably stopped right there. King, we've come to a conclusion. The queen was wrong. Now, you didn't do anything wrong. The queen is the one at fault. She's the one who has done wrong. Now, this conclusion is right out of the heart of a male-dominated culture. For example, no mention is made of the fact that the request that Xerxes made of Vashti just might be out of line and disrespectful to her reputation. Can't mention that. Can't tell the king that his request was out of line. No. Queen Vashti was done wrong. No suggestion is made that Xerxes just might be the one to blame for the whole incident. Can't do that. The queen is wrong. No comment is made that Vashti just might have been correct in rejecting the king's summons. Oh, can't say no to the king. Queen Vashti is at fault. That's their conclusion. So, he goes on to say, she's done wrong against the king. But not just the king. No. She's done wrong against all the nobles, which was Memucan and his 6 buddies. And all the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. She has done wrong against the entire Persian Empire. All 127 provinces. She has done wrong by everybody. The queen is wrong. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, so that they will despise their husbands. It's interesting that Memucan believes that somehow, if we don't do something with Vashti, there's going to be this women's liberation movement that is just going to take over the Persian Empire. And all the women are going to rally together and start despising their husbands and not obeying them. This is 480 BC. There's no way that's going to happen. In 2024, maybe, but not in 480 BC. I mean, that's ludicrous. It's just not going to happen. But somehow he thinks it is. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility, and he's part of the nobility, Memucan, meaning his wife, who hears about the queen's conduct, will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. So, this thing's going to spread. It's going to impact all the nobles and their wives and all the wives, every marriage out there in the Persian Empire. There's going to be this incredible women's movement that's going to sweep through, and all the men are going to suffer from disrespect and dishonor. Well, honor and respect were very common themes back in the ancient world. And they're actually quite common themes today. Men will gravitate to the areas where they can find the most honor and respect. A man will spend the majority of his time, if he can, in the place where he receives the most honor and respect. Now, for some men, that is at home. And with his wife and children, if he's dad and he's looked up to and he's respected, he will love spending time at home. For many men, it's the place of work. They're very good at what they do, and they get a lot of accolades, a lot of pats on the back, a lot of words of honor and respect from coworkers and bosses, and they are just phenomenal at work, and it's a wonderful place for them. And so they want to spend a lot of time there. For other men, it could be church. They could be recognized, as a deacon or as a great teacher or someone who's looked up to by everyone in the church. And so they want to spend a lot of time there because the church people give them lots of honor and lots of respect. For other men, it's the golf course. They're pretty good at the game of golf. Their buddies are always asking for advice and a few lessons here and there. And whenever they go out, he always shoots the best score. And so he gets a lot of honor and respect. Or it could be fishing. He goes out fishing and he always comes back with a lot of fish. And everybody's jealous because he's so good at that. So these men, in asking for honor and respect, is not a strange thing. It's not an unusual thing. Men seem to be wired in the direction of honor and respect. And you may know some friends, some family members, some neighbors, where the guy, the husband, is really good at work. I mean, he's got a top position in work, but he's a lousy husband and a lousy father because he's never been taught. And he doesn't want to be around his family because they tend to disrespect him, but the people at work respect him, so he becomes a workaholic and neglects his family. Doesn't go to the kids' games, doesn't show up for the wives' things. It happens. Or he gets off work and instead of spending time with his wife and his children, he goes to the golf course or goes fishing or somewhere else where he can receive honor because he doesn't receive the honor at home. So what these men are asking for is a real need for men. The problem is they're asking for it in the wrong way. Their approach is not the right approach. So, that's the proposal. Somehow, every Persian man ought to be the king of his own home and receive honor and respect from his wife, especially. And that leads us to the queen's punishment in the king's decree. A decree is going to be issued, of all things. This little issue between the king and the queen is going to end up with a decree that's going to impact the entire Persian Empire. The queen will be stripped of her royal title, and she'll be banned from the king's presence. And the purpose of this whole thing, of this decree, is to give men authority, respect, and honor in their homes. Now, how many people think that a decree is going to pull that off? That, women are going to read this and go, wow, look what I need to do. I need to give respect and honor to my husband. Wow, now there's a law telling me to do this, and I'm going to do it now. Especially since this edict comes from a king who can't get respect from his own palace. I mean, here's an edict calling for respect, and he comes from somebody who's being disrespected by his own wife. The irony of all of this. Well, verse 19, Memucan says to the king, "If it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed." So apparently a Persian law, once the law is made, you can't go back on it. So you can't make a law on Monday and then change it on Thursday. And certainly part of that is, if you make the law on Monday and change it on Thursday, you've got a leader who can't make up his mind, and who can follow a leader who can't make up his mind? Now, in the book of Daniel and Esther, we have reference to these Persian laws that can't be changed. Secular literature never tells us about that fact, but there is this tradition that goes back to Hammurabi, back in the 18th century BC, that a judge could not change a decision that had been made. So once the judge makes his decision, he can't go back and call everyone else back into the courtroom 3 weeks later and say, "I've changed my mind." And there is this royal code of honor where it's out of question for the king to change his mind, to rescind his decision. Now, I grew up watching baseball, and especially before instant replay. There'd be a close play, whether it's a ball or a strike or a safe or out, and the umpire would make his decision. I have never watched a game where the umpire has changed his mind. For years I used to watch managers come running out of the dugout, yelling and screaming, throwing their hat, kicking dirt on the umpire, kicking dirt over home plate to try to get the umpire to change his mind, and he never did. Once the umpire makes up his mind, that's it. Today we have instant replay. So we don't have managers running out of the dugout anymore, throwing their hat and yelling and screaming. They just say, go like this, which means we want a video review of that. But whoever does that video review has the final word. And they never change their mind. So there's this whole idea of once a decision is made, a decision has been made. So once the king issues the royal edict, he's not going to take it back. So, what's going to happen? Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Now, Vashti is no longer going to be the queen, and she can no longer come into the presence of the king. And there's a pretty good chance that when Vashti hears this, she's going to respond by saying, "Really? I didn't like the guy to begin with." So, for me not to go into the presence of the king again is actually a good thing, because I don't want to see that monster. You kind of get the impression that Vashti and Xerxes never really got along. Now, some of the Jewish scholars and interpreters think this is a euphemism for the fact that Vashti was executed. But there's no evidence for that. In fact, there's not even any evidence that she gets divorced. She gets demoted to a lesser place in the harem, where she's no longer allowed to actually come into the presence of the king. And what did she not want to do? Come into the presence of the king during that banquet. So in essence, she sort of gets what she wanted from this whole incident. And then, the king has to give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. What we know of Vashti in this one chapter is that she's a very beautiful woman. And apparently she's a woman of dignity and character. Which raises the question, how do you get anybody any better? But when Xerxes hears the word better, he doesn't hear the word better. He hears the phrase more obedient. So, king, you need a more obedient wife. You need someone who's going to honor you and respect you, even if you ask them to do something stupid or ridiculous or embarrassing or disrespectful or dishonoring. That they'll do it anyways because, after all, king, you are the king. Somebody better. When the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. Wow. That edict was actually given in about 480 BC. So from 480 BC until 2024, that means every woman has always respected her husband. Not a chance. Respect is normally something you earn, not something you legislate. So here's the king and his so-called smart advisors telling him to issue this royal edict. So now everybody in the kingdom, every woman in the Persian Empire is going to respect her husband from this day forward. And there's no way it's going to happen. This is a good time to talk about what the Bible says about respect. Because the Bible actually tells women to respect their husbands. But the Bible tells women to respect their husbands in response to love expressed and demonstrated to her by her husband. And Paul wraps up his thoughts about marriage in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 33. And in this verse, it's almost like somebody said to Paul, tell us what you know about marriage in like one sentence. You know, if we don't get anything else, make sure we get this point. So what does Paul write? However, each of you, he's talking to men, he's talking to husbands, each of you husbands also must love his wife as he loves himself. And the wife must respect her husband. So husband, love your wife. Wife, respect your husband. Psychologists, psychiatrists, marriage experts have done surveys throughout the years, and here's their conclusion. The number one emotional need of a man in a marriage is love and respect. So what does the husband most need from his wife? Honor and respect. The number one emotional need of a wife, of a woman in a marriage, is love and security. So what does the wife most need from her husband? She needs love and security. And this is actually a beautiful thing when it works. I'll often tell people it takes two people to make a marriage work and only one to mess the whole thing up. True. Because here's how it works. And as the man, as the leader, you go first. So, husband, you're to love your wife. What's missing from this royal edict? There's nothing about how the husband is supposed to treat the wife. It's all about how the wife is to treat the husband. So the husband wants respect, but he doesn't want to do anything to gain that respect. Which is why it's so ludicrous, because it doesn't work. But when the husband loves the wife, and the wife feels loved, it's easy for her to respect her husband and to honor her husband. The man loves me, and I know it. At the same time, when a husband feels respected and honored by his wife, it's very easy for him to love her. But what happens when it doesn't go well? When a wife doesn't feel loved, it's difficult for her to respect and honor her husband. Vashti was not feeling very loved that night by King Xerxes. If the man loved me, he would not be asking me to do this. She didn't feel loved, and she didn't give back any respect and honor either. She told the guy, take a hike. So, if the wife is not feeling loved, it's difficult for her to show honor and respect. At the same time, if a husband does not feel honored and respected by his wife, he finds it difficult to love her. So it's interesting in this very secular story, remember, God's not even mentioned at all in the book of Esther, that they get half of it right. But the men want the respect, but they're not willing to give the love. That's where they mess up. They got part of it right. In fact, from a Christian standpoint, if you ask Paul, well, what does love mean? Paul says, love your wife as Christ loved you. Oh, sorry, I asked. I thought it was going to be, a little answer down here. You've raised the bar way up here. Just love your wife the way Jesus loved you. Well, how much respect and honor am I supposed to show to that old boy? Well, treat your husband the same way you would treat Jesus. Well, of course I would honor and respect Jesus, The bar gets raised very high by the Apostle Paul. And the problem with this royal edict is that it puts all the blame on the wife, all the blame on the women, and no responsibility on the men or the husbands. And that's why we read this and we absolutely laugh as we go back to let all the women respect their husbands. Well, if all the women were loved by their husbands, respect and honor would come a whole lot easier. Moving on to verse 21, the king and his nobles were pleased with this advice. So the king did as Memucan proposed. They actually sent out this royal edict. How ludicrous. And people are going to ask, where is this coming from? What's the story behind this royal edict? I remember years ago I was interviewing for a youth pastor position, and they kept asking me questions about money. What did I feel about money, and how did I view money, and all these questions about money. And finally I just asked them, why are you asking me all of these questions about money? And the answer was the previous youth pastor was suspected of stealing money. And so that's where all the questions about money were coming from. So where's this whole thing about respecting your husband coming from? The women are going to ask. And pretty soon, everyone in the Persian Empire is going to know the story about Vashti in what she did to King Xerxes. And it's interesting and ironic that the king didn't want that spread everywhere. But by issuing his own royal decree, that story's going to circulate like wildfire throughout the Persian Empire. And they accept it. They like it. Of course they like it. They get all the benefits and no responsibility. I mean, anybody would sign up for that. I think the wives should have written one in reverse that, the husbands were to love their wives. Not that we're going to show you any honor and respect. You just love us. Well, they send it to everywhere in the Persian Empire. And the Persians had a great system of communication. It was similar to the Pony Express. So if you were going to send this edict out to some place, and it's going to take 4 days by horseback, you would have one man on horseback go as far as he could for day 1, hand it off to somebody else who takes it for day 2, then day 3, and then day 4. They had an incredible system of communicating and getting the word out, kind of an early edition of the post office, including, according to Herodotus, that neither snow, rain, heat, or darkness deters them from their task. Sounds like the modern day post office. The mailman will deliver regardless. This edict to protect the king ends up making the king look rather foolish. I mean, here's a king who doesn't know how to interact with the queen, his wife. The king has no skills at home. So the king issues this royal decree that wives are to respect their husbands. But yet this is coming from a man who got no respect from the queen. It's like, be careful who you take advice from. You don't take advice on marriage from someone who's working on their 6th, unless you want to work on your 6th one day. So here's the king who seems to know nothing about married life and how to have a happy, prosperous married life, giving marital advice. So will this protect the king from getting another queen like Vashti? There's a lot of humor in this, and there's supposed to be. Because when this story was read, if you want to make fun of King Xerxes, this is your chance to do it. Because the man's a nut. He has no business running the Persian Empire because he can't even run his own home. But at the same time, there's a great lesson about husbands and wives and what the Bible really says about respect and honor and love and security, and how a husband and a wife are to treat each other. Mutual respect and honor and love go a long way in a marriage. And to treat your spouse as Christ has treated you is also a great lesson for all of us. So in the midst of this rather humorous Persian story, there's a great lesson about marriage for all of us as well. Well, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this crazy story. It's a story of people who really don't know you, who don't have your wisdom, trying to figure out life here on earth. And they get part of it right, but they leave out the most important part. And that's the responsibility of the husband to initiate and love his wife. So, Father, may we, as we laugh through this story and see the craziness of it, at the same time take serious how we treat one another. And may we treat one another with love and honor and respect in everything that we do. So, Father, may this story help us in our personal relationships with people, and asking how the other person might feel if they follow our request. And maybe we wouldn't make such ridiculous requests of people. So, Father, teach us your ways that we may walk closely with you. I pray In Jesus' name, amen.